The inaugural issue of the New Thinking Aloud magazine was just released on March 1st. You can download a free PDF copy from the New Thinking Aloud Foundation website. That's newthinkingaloud.org. You can even order a printed copy from nta-magazine.magcloud.com.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we'll be exploring science fiction and mythology. With me is Professor Thomas Lombardo, who is the author of a forthcoming 4-volume series on science fiction as the evolutionary mythology of the future. He is the director of the Center for Future Consciousness in Glendale, Arizona, and is the author of Future Consciousness, The Path to Purposeful Evolution. His other titles include Wisdom, Consciousness, and the Future, and Mind Flight, A Journey into the Future, and also The Evolution of Future Consciousness. Welcome, Tom.
Hello, Jeff. Good morning.
It's a pleasure to be with you once again and to discuss one of your favorite subjects, science fiction.
Yes, my lifelong passion since I've been 10 years old, probably.
Yeah. Well, I've been aware as a moviegoer that there is a very thin line between science fiction and mythology. All of the movies about Hercules and the Homeric epics have a real science fiction feel to them.
Yes, the early myths reliably contained fantastical elements with beings with incredible powers. And in fact, the recent wave of movies dealing with Marvel comic superheroes, all of those superheroes being science fiction characters, having various technological enhanced abilities, etc. They are, in fact, modern-day versions of the various beings and deities imagined in mythologies of ancient times who possess superior powers of one kind or another. So that's a continuation, actually, over a 2,000-year period.
My favorite Marvel hero is Dr. Strange, and he really does bridge the gap between science fiction and mythology.
Oh, yeah, definitely, because Dr. Strange has a variety of psychic powers and the capacity to manipulate reality at some very deep levels. And in fact, that's an idea that both runs back into the history of mythology and the history of fantasy, and that we see in various forms in science fiction running up to the present. So yes, in fact, that's one of my favorite of the Marvel comic movies that has been made so far.
Well, we did an earlier interview on the mythology related to the apocalypse and doomsday. And you pointed out there that the myth of the end of, or the great battle that ends history, started in the religious writings of Zarathustra and has continued up to current science fiction.
Yes, in fact, one common theme within the history of science fiction has been scenarios dealing with the end of the world. And whether that end of the world comes through natural forces, man-made forces, or astronomical forces or alien forces, it is repeatedly been dealt with throughout the entire history of science fiction. One example that pops into my mind of a different type than we previously talked about is the classic science fiction novel written in the 1930s, made into a movie in the 1950s, When Worlds Collide.
Mm-hmm.
And in that story, a star and planet come into our solar system, and the star eventually collides with the Earth, completely destroying the Earth.
Mm-hmm.
And humans have to migrate to a new planet. In fact, the planet that was revolving around that particular sun that collided with the Earth.
Mm.
So we, in fact, have repeatedly envisioned multiple ways in which human civilization and the Earth could end, not just simply by our own hands, as in the Battle of Armageddon scenario, but in terms of other forces or aliens, for example, coming and destroying the Earth.
Mm-hmm. Well, to me, as I understand Joseph Campbell and the other writers about mythology, the purpose of mythology, as I see it, is to unite the individual who seems alone and isolated. Alan Watts once referred to people as a skin-encapsulated ego, that we are actually somehow connected to the whole cosmos, and mythology provides that link.
Yes. In fact, a couple expressions that I use are science fiction as well as mythology stimulates cosmic consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
It stimulates the experience of being in some kind of relationship with the universe, with the whole.
Yeah.
Another term that frequently gets used both in talking about science fiction and talking about classical mythology is transcendence.
Mm-hmm.
And so mythology could be seen as an effort to realize transcendence,
Mm-hmm.
to see beyond oneself, to see beyond the immediate here and now, to transcend to some higher level.
Mm-hmm.
And a theory of how science fiction is identical with ancient mythology is that science fiction attempts to realize the transcendent, but a credible transcendence. And by credible, I mean a vision that would seem plausible
Mm-hmm.
within contemporary science and contemporary thought. Now, ancient mythology was also seen as credible in its visions of transcendence, but it was based upon earlier theories of reality.
Mm-hmm.
So what we have in present times is a scientifically informed theory of reality.
Yeah.
And so within the context of that theory of reality, can we realize, can we write about, can we experience a credible transcendence? And presumably that's central to what science fiction does.
Yeah. Well, a lot of people in my area of parapsychology, transpersonal psychology would say that in developing a scientific worldview, modernists have to some extent thrown the baby out with the bathwater. That is, they've rejected the supernatural and maybe have gone too far. Maybe there are elements of the supernatural that really can fit into a modern scientific paradigm.
Yes. Well, the way I would comment on that would be that science fiction attempts to explore plausible realities either in the future or even plausible alternative realities.
Alternative histories.
Alternative histories as well.
Yeah.
But what turns out to be plausible is open to considerable interpretation and inventiveness.
And the skill of the writer.
Yeah. And consequently, all of the elements that you would see in ancient mythologies that might be referred to as supernatural, or, for example, is psychic, or lying outside the boundaries of a materialistic framework of understanding reality, various science fiction writers will introduce such elements into their writing, either attempting or not attempting to make them seem plausible, convincing, realistic. A key strength of a good science fiction writer is, can he make his scenario appear realistic and convincing? So one can have a science fiction novel such as The Demolished Man by Alfred Bester, which won the first Hugo as Best Science Fiction Novel of the Year, in which the police force are mind readers. And the head of the police force is attempting to prove the guilt of the richest man in the world who has murdered his father and is now trying to get away from it. But Alfred Bester does a very good job of attempting to describe how you could have a set of minds that were in conscious contact with each other, and how they would live their lives and how they would communicate with each other. And this he envisions as something in the future. So it comes off very realistic and very skillful, and in its own way, very convincing.
It sounds similar to Minority Report.
Yes.
The movie I'm thinking of is based on a novel.
In Minority Report, the characters, the precogs, could see into the future. And one can find throughout various science fiction stories all of the different fundamental psychic capacities, presumed psychic capacities that either aliens or humans possess. A classic example of a different type of psychic ability would be from the movie Forbidden Planet, where the advanced, highly advanced Krell, who are aliens who live on obviously on another planet, have developed a supportive technology that allows them to materialize anything they wish for or desire. So we have complete mind over matter in this, and we have the capacity to manifest whatever one wants and wishes.
And as I recall, even the robot in that movie had the ability to manufacture bottles of alcohol for one of the crew members.
Yeah, but he did it with his little miniature chemistry set in his belly.
I see.
Okay, it wasn't psychic. It was just, it was good.
Okay.
It was very compact science. Although the science that was used to invent that robot was Krell science, very advanced science.
This is one of my all-time favorite movies. I saw it when I was like 8 years old. And it made a huge impact on me.
And I think Forbidden Planet is, in fact, one of the best science fiction movies ever made. I think it was the best science fiction movie of the 1950s. And just to throw a little plug in here, if you go to my website, Center for Future Consciousness, I do have a list up there of what I consider to be the best science fiction movies ever made, as well as the best science fiction novels ever written. And Forbidden Planet, I actually rate as number 4 on my list, followed by or preceded by Blade Runner and Brazil and Metropolis.
The intriguing thing to me about Forbidden Planet is you have the human scientist who is living on this planet with his beautiful daughter, who, of whom he's rather possessive, who starts to fall in love with the captain of a spaceship who has landed, and he's jealous of the daughter, but he knows how to use the Krell technology. And he creates from his own mind what Freud might call the monsters of the id.
Yes, and in fact, that's what destroyed the Krell, was their monsters of the id. And that's what makes for good science fiction when you combine some interesting technologies, some interesting speculations on alternative or future realities with a very good plot and interesting characters. And Forbidden Planet definitely has some interesting characters, and it does have a fundamental psychological and philosophical theme.
It really highlights the Freudian notion of
it does.
The repressed contents of our unconscious mind.
Yes, and that's a psychological theme. And it also brings up the philosophical question of if one were given absolute power, would that in fact be a good thing?
Yeah.
Now, the Crow presumably were ethically evolved and very wise, and yet somehow or other, even with all that wisdom and mental development, it never seemed to have dawned on them that they did in fact have this primordial animal psyche deep in their minds that they could give power to with their technologies. And what happens is that in giving power to it, they mutually annihilate each other. So I think there's a little flaw in the movie in that if they were that wise, they should have figured that out, that would have happened. But be that as it may, if one were to have absolute power, there is the warning there of being able to use it wisely and with foresight. And even the poor Krell, who are very admirable, seem to have failed in that regard.
Well, it does seem as if we look at mythology, the story of the gods, the wisest of the gods, the most powerful of the gods, all seem to have tragic flaws.
And tragic flaws do help to create for drama and action and interaction between characters. I would say, though, that we do have the notions that come out of Western religion of a ethically perfect God and an omniscient and omnipotent God who doesn't have any flaws. But then that doesn't make for a very interesting story.
Well, in the case of Christianity, you have Jesus, who is like the perfect human being, but in Jungian terms, he has a twin brother, Satan.
Yes. And in fact, I find a much more interesting movie to watch regarding the life of Jesus, the movie The Last Temptation of Christ, where Jesus does have psychological weaknesses and flaws and has to struggle with them and has a final struggle at the end to achieve his mission. And that makes for a more dramatic and realistic story.
Well, the mythologies of the world are populated by beings like Jesus, one might say, angels and heroes who are sort of halfway between human and the divine.
Yes. And in fact, I would suggest that the demons and angels of ancient myth and fantasy have simply been reconceptualized now in modern science fiction as both malevolent and benevolent aliens who come out of the sky. So we have Alien from the movie series, the movie Alien series, who is a demon from the sky. And we have the characters in Close Encounters who are angels that have come out of the sky. And we have, in fact, in 2001, by Arthur C. Clarke, we have very benevolent and extremely powerful enigmatic aliens who facilitate our evolution in the movie and in the novel 2001. And they are almost godlike. I will throw in as a paradox and ambiguity into this, Arthur C. Clarke's 1950s novel, Childhood's End.
I was just thinking of it.
You were good.
Yeah.
Okay, because...
That's a classic.
Yes, because the aliens who come to Earth to help us move to our next level of evolution... Benevolent aliens, they turn out to be spitting images of Satan. Yeah, and
red skin,
the horns, the tail, the whole thing, right? And so Clarke introduces in that novel this ambiguity or speculative theme of that perhaps deep within our psyches, we had this premonition of these beings coming who would take us to a new level and would spell the end of humanity. And we personified that premonition as evil,
right,
even though in essence it was benevolent because it was moving us forward.
Well, and we have, I think, in Christian mythology, this kind of inversion that goes on where some things that are thought to be really positive, like many people say, if we could only have a global society, a world government, how many problems we could solve that way. And then you get the notion of the beast of the apocalypse who is going to appear as a prophet of unity and world government, but is really evil.
Yes, yes. And in fact, what science fiction can take you into is the question of what is really evil and bad for us, and what would be a dystopian society or dystopian reality versus what would be beneficial, what would be good, what would be positive. I think of, as an example, to elaborate on that, I think of the science fiction novel Darwin's Radio by Greg Bear, a relatively recent novel. And it deals with human evolution, and in fact, it deals with the next species that will come after us who emerge through the biological evolutionary process, and they have certain capacities that we do not possess, and they don't exactly look like us. And humans, our present humans, they take them as they are being born, as they spot them, and they put them into prisons because they are afraid of them, and they realize, of course, that they may in fact be the beings who replace us in terms of sovereignty on the earth. And they say, the regular humans say that they have some kind of disease. See, so we may see as evil and bad or threatening something which is in some significant way superior to us, but in fact would threaten our sovereignty and would threaten our continued existence, at least as the dominant species on the earth.
Well, the idea of how humans react to other intelligent species is quite interesting. I know you shared with me earlier a novel about Neanderthals reemerging.
Oh, yes, yes. Actually, that's the Neanderthal Parallax, and by Robert Sawyer, who's a Canadian science fiction writer, and it's an alternative universe scenario. And what he envisions is that there is an alternative universe and an alternative Earth in which Homo sapien dies out and Neanderthal becomes the technologically advanced and civilized species. And there is a Neanderthal quantum computer scientist who, while he's messing with his machinery, he has an impact down at the quantum level of reality, and he throws himself accidentally into our reality. And so the novel deals with him looking at how we behave in our kind of culture versus the culture that emerged in this alternative Neanderthal modern society. And there's some very striking differences, like the Neanderthals do not wage war, but they do not believe in an afterlife. They are all bisexual, and so they have a same-sex and they have a complementary sex partner. They never developed agriculture, but they control their population. And the earth has not been overrun by cities and industry. But on the other hand, the Neanderthals very rarely ever engage in any criminal behavior, because one technology they've developed is they have this little device that is put on their wrist when they're young that produces a recording of everything that they do in their life. So they know that if they do something which is against the law and they're brought to trial for it, there will be unequivocal evidence regarding whether or not they committed the transgression or not. And so by virtue of the fact that they know they're always being watched, they are ethically very superior to us. But there's a sense in which, they're ethically more advanced because they realize they have no place to hide if they want to do something that's considered unlawful or unethical.
Well, it's one of the things that science fiction does do is explores different ethical systems.
Yes, it does. Yes. And in fact, this would be a good place to introduce a very important theme in my book, which is that the term science fiction is a bit of a misnomer because we can imagine that science fiction only deals with the possibilities of science and technology, when actually science fiction historically has dealt with all aspects of the future. It deals with the future of everything. And it frequently gets into humanistic, psychological, ethical, and social issues and speculations regarding the future. It even gets into, as you brought up already, alternative histories. So it is a very integrative visioning of both the future and of alternative realities. And one fundamental theme within science fiction has been images of dystopias and utopias of the future, and questions of what would be a more ethically advanced society and what would it mean for a society to have ethically devolved and be a terrible society at a moral level.
Well, you're reminding me of a book which was required reading in my freshman psychology course by B.F. Skinner.
Yes.
I can't quite think of the name.
Walden II.
Walden II.
Yes.
That's a classic.
Yes, it's a classic. And although you might not imagine that Walden II is science fiction, it is science fiction because if you think of psychology as a science, then what Skinner does in Walden II is he applies the science of his psychology, behavioral psychology to invent, speculate on a alternative society that in fact operates according to the principles of behavioral psychology. He thinks it's a great reality, but he got a lot of flack on it, and the flack he got on it primarily had to do with the fact that it's a totally controlled society. So he creates, through principles of reinforcement and operant conditioning, creative and highly motivated and happy and positive people by reinforcing them systematically for good behavior and extinguishing what would be considered negative behavior. But this seems to be an infringement on human freedom then.
Yeah, I mean, Skinner was, I think, arguing in behalf of behavioral scientists engaging in social engineering.
Of course.
But his book probably had the opposite effect.
Well, what it did was it provoked all of the defenders of individual self-determination to rise up and say, this is not a good system, even if you get these happy people, because you are taking away their individual freedom, and that fundamentally is unethical. It hits us at one of the most basic values that we have as humans, which is self-determination.
And you see that in many, for example, Star Trek episodes. I've seen that theme.
Yes, right. And in fact, science fiction dystopias usually revolve around human freedom and self-determination being taken away from us. 1984 and Brave New World. Now, people may not be as familiar with it, but the classic dystopia, and it's an interesting one, which I'll come to, was written before those two and actually inspired 1984. And the title of it was We, and it was by Yevgeny Ziamatin. And it was a future world in which all the buildings in the cities of that world were all glass. And so everybody could watch everybody else. And it was modeled on mathematical and geometrical principles. And our central character is a mathematician who sees everything through mathematical eyes. And the only thing you could do in private is have sex. Then you could pull the curtains down. But everything else, you're being watched. Okay. And the central figurehead in this futurist world believes that the fundamental disease of human consciousness is the belief in a self or a personality, and one needs to eradicate that, and then we will have a smoothly running society. So you could see this as a extreme dystopia, a dystopia where individuality is actually turned into a vice, and yet there's something very ambiguous about it, because in the end of the story, our character seems to embrace and enthusiastically embrace this world because it is so smoothly running and beautiful, and all the parts work together as a whole.
It reminds me of a story, maybe you know the title. I read it as a teenager and I don't remember the name, but it did impact me, about a person who is put into a tank and his brain or his skull is united with like a dozen other people. They're all in this tank together, and he finally escapes. He gets out of the tank and he recovers his individuality, but then he realizes he was much happier in the tank, and at the end of the story, he goes back in.
Okay. I don't recall that off the top of my head. But what you're bringing up there is you're bringing up the theme of will we be able to achieve through technology or a mental evolution communal consciousness?
Yes.
Some people will say, this is a great thing. Yeah, we should go for it. You know, we can have a greater sense of intimacy and a greater sense of cooperation.
Right.
And other people might say, this is terrible. I don't want anybody in my mind, and I don't want to be meshed into a bigger whole. I don't want to be a cell within a homogestalt that's bigger than me. The challenge would be how you could have your cake and eat it too here. That is, how individuality could be preserved or enhanced, and yet at the same time be able to somehow realize higher forms of communal consciousness. That's a puzzle that Olaf Stapleton thought about, and that other people have thought about too within science fiction, because it seems as if a fundamental theme that runs through a lot of dystopian science fiction is the robbing of individuality and self-determination. And that is seen as the pivotal flaw of these envisioned in these dystopian realities. But then on the other hand, you find dystopian realities where the flaw seems to be that everybody has too much freedom and there's nothing controlling and no communal.
I think that's sort of the beauty of science fiction, is you can explore these themes from every angle. And when you look at the multiverse of science fiction writers, you see almost every possibility being probed.
Yes, and in fact, you hit an important nail on the head. Science fiction has the strength of being narrative and engaging the reader or the viewer in a total person immersion. You really get into it because you're either watching or you're reading a story. And so it taps into your holistic consciousness. Now, given the fact that we have many, many different writers who will explore many different possibilities, we can vicariously experience multiple futures, multiple perspectives on any given future, and multiple realities. And we're not just getting an abstract theory here, we're actually getting a simulation and a vicarious encounter with each of these alternatives and as many different inventive alternatives as new writers can come up with.
And the intriguing thing to me is that on occasion, some of these novels and movies have actually inspired scientists to go and make discoveries that they read about first in fiction.
Yes. The classic example being Robert Goddard, who's one of the key architects in the development of modern rocketry, was inspired to go into the pursuit of the study of rockets when he was young from reading H.G. Wells' The War of the Worlds. And many space scientists and space technologists have gone into that area through reading stories of space exploration. But science fiction deals with a lot more than just space exploration, and consequently people in other sciences have been inspired by various ideas that science fiction writers have first proposed. And science fiction provides the freedom to explore social political possibilities. So there's a famous book that's about science fiction, written about 20 years ago now, called The Dreams Our Stuff is Made Of, and How Science Fiction Conquered the World by Thomas Dish. And his argument is that the stuff we have around us was built on human dreams, human images, human imagination. And where did those dreams come from? They frequently came from science fiction. And so science fiction provides the mental material to create and inspire people in the world that we see around us.
And one of the most fascinating developments in our era is now we're seeing video games that are incorporating science fiction themes, so that the not just video games, but fantasy role-playing games as well, so that people really do immerse themselves. They become the characters. And I'm thinking, for example, one of my favorite novels that was made into a movie is Ender's Game by Orson Scott Card, where you see a young child becomes adept at video games, attacking space invaders. And, well, it just so happens that there's a need for a very skilled warrior who can attack real space invaders, and the child is recruited and defeats the aliens.
Yes. And there's a variety of different implications and significant points connected with video games. Number one, it's one form of total person immersion into a science fiction reality, and it's an active immersion.
It's becoming ever more realistic with virtual reality equipment.
Yes. And in fact, that brings up the second point, which is that science fiction scenarios can deal with futures in which we literally live and exist in virtual realities. So humans are gradually being pulled into this alternative reality through video games that they eventually may spend their entire lives in, with this interesting flexibility now that in a video, take that back, in a virtual reality universe, I can realize multiple different simulated physical forms with multiple different abilities and powers. So when we talk about science fiction conquering the world, it doesn't have to be that the aliens come down and oppress us through physical force. It could be like in Brave New World, which is what's happening with virtual reality, where we are being drawn and enticed into this science fiction-like reality and having fun with it while we're becoming part of it.
And movies like the Matrix series seem to raise the philosophical question, are we already in a virtual reality and don't know it?
Yes, and actually the Matrix was based on a thought experiment that the 17th century philosopher René Descartes proposed. And the thought experiment was, is there any way for me to tell for sure whether I might not be laying on a table in a laboratory with wires hooked up to my brain that were being controlled by this malevolent and extremely powerful scientist stimulating my brain, so I thought I actually was sitting here in the French cafe, but I'm really not. And that's the Matrix.
Descartes put it that way?
He did. Of course he did. When I started watching The Matrix, I thought, this is Descartes' experiment put into computer high-tech form. But it's the same fundamental idea. In fact, you like The Matrix, and of course The Matrix is dealing with virtual reality, which brings up a significant theme in science fiction of alternative realities and trying to figure out whether the reality that I'm in right now is in fact what I take it to be, and might it not, maybe there's something here strange that I'm missing or not seeing. So a classic example who does this along multiple pathways is Philip K. Dick. And Philip K. Dick attempted within science fiction to explore the notion of multiple versions or interpretations of the nature of reality. And Philip K. Dick was extremely intelligent, extremely convincing, and he appears to have been rather psychotic, which added into the stew. So Dick not only speculates on, well, maybe we'll go to Mars, or maybe we'll invent a time machine, but he speculates on, am I dead or alive? Am I a spirit or am I something physical? Is time moving backwards or forwards? Am I crazy and are aliens talking to me? And is this the only possible outcome of the flow of historical events? Maybe there's other ones. Maybe there's multiple universes here running parallel. So he wants to question through science fiction our notions of sanity, of reality, and of who and what we are, and even if we indeed have a self. So he really pushes on the deep philosophical issues
and mythological
issues of reality,
which is, we started to say, science fiction is the mythology of the future.
Age. Yes, and in fact, just so that I explain this to the viewers, if you look at the various qualities of ancient myths, and then you look at the qualities of science fiction, they line up perfectly. They have all the same qualities. The significant difference between the two is that ancient myths were informed and inspired by ancient theories of reality, whereas science fiction is informed and inspired by more modern theories of reality, although sometimes they draw the ancient theories of reality and mix them together. And so it has all the same qualities, all the same functions, and that's what makes it mythological, often even with some of the same symbols. And it's evolutionary because it's not a static mythology. It's a continually evolving mythology which keeps building on itself, and it's often informed by evolution. And its purpose is to actually keep moving the evolution of our future consciousness, of our holistic consciousness forward. So it serves an evolutionary function.
Well, Professor Thomas Lombardo, you have done a fabulous job of sharing your love of science fiction with me and with the audience. And I know just from listening to you, I want to read more and become more well-informed about this exciting area of fiction. It's always been, for me, my favorite movies, my favorite books have been science fiction. So I'm delighted to share this time with you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
And thank you for being with us.
Thank you.